Now, this week we are doing the whole area of sickness, pain, and suffering. Or for short, we call it SPS, okay, sickness, pain, and suffering. So these are 9 myths that sometimes as Christians we believe about pain, suffering, and even the whole area of evil. So I'm just going to run through it very slowly, and we discuss as we go along, okay? Firstly, some people think that all suffering is a result of my own sin. That all suffering is a result of my own sin. Okay, so this is not true, it's a myth, okay? Some suffering is the result of other people's sin or other people's decision and even natural event because we live in a fallen world. So it's something for us even to consider and to be clear about. Okay, so there'll be some references and all that, you can look them up. Okay, so don't always think that because I'm suffering, I must have sinned. Okay, and the classical example will be example of Job. Job suffered tremendously, and yet because we know the background of why it happened, we can tell for sure that it wasn't his sin that caused it, but something that God allowed Satan to do. I think that's something for us to bear in mind, okay? So when you suffer and you're in sickness or in pain and all that, I think sometimes, yes, we got to check ourselves, see whether there's anything in our life that we need to set right with God. But we mustn't always lay the blame on ourselves, as what Job's friend did. They came and kept on pointing out to him, you must have sinned. If you didn't sin, then you will not be so, you will not lose all your children, lose all your possession, even your health is affected. Okay, so I think we need to be careful in the area of suffering or pain or sickness. Yes, we check ourselves, but we mustn't in a way condemn ourselves. Sometimes we go to the extent of trying to find sin or confess sin that's not there. Okay, so that is also not right. So you need to keep that in mind. Okay. Secondly, that all suffering is caused by someone else's sin. Okay, the sin of my parents, the sin of here and this and that. Okay, I think that is also not right. Sometimes our own sin do cause us suffering. And the classical example would be Achan, okay, in Joshua chapter 7, where due to greed, he saw the Babylonian robe that was very nice and very expensive, and decided to take it and hike it for himself. You cannot blame anybody else. It was his own greed that caused him to be judged and caused him and the whole family to be in a way condemned. Okay, so some suffering is because of our greed, our own sin, and that's important for us to remember. Or even as we read about the last week, okay, lust and temptation, humility and pride and all that, David and Bathsheba. David sinned, Bathsheba sinned, and the son, the child who was born, okay, was innocent, and yet the child suffered, okay, no sin of his, but the sin of the parents. So I think it's important for us even to recall and remember that, okay? So don't always equate suffering with sin, either my sin or somebody else's sin. But there's a place for us to take stock, not all the time blame ourselves and not all the time to blame others. I think that's important as well. Thirdly, no suffering is a result of sin. That also is not right, because we know that the fall of man in the Garden of Eden, Genesis chapter 3, when God told Adam and Eve not to eat and they ate, that was disobedient to God and that was sin. And as a result, they got chased out of paradise and they suffered. They suffered greatly. And since then, all of mankind have suffered. Okay? So sin definitely has a part to play in suffering. But the good news is, in Revelation 21, there will come a time there will be no more pain and suffering. At the end of time, the new heaven and new earth, there will be no more pain and suffering. Okay? So out of the 9 myths, okay, all suffering results my own sin, that's not right. All suffering is caused by someone else's sin, also not right. Okay? And sin definitely has a part to play in suffering. Okay, I think that's important. So the first 3 myths that we talk about. Number 4, suffering is always good. Okay, there are some people who go around looking for suffering. Why? They say, oh, suffering will make me better, a better Christian, a better follower of Jesus. Also not right. Okay, yes, God can use suffering, but we should not always look for suffering. Okay, so Adam and Eve, because of disobedience, they suffered. And in the way, it's not good because they chased out from the Garden of Eden, from paradise, and they paid a high price. Okay, even for Cain and Abel, Cain killed Abel, and he suffered for it. And it was not for any good, but for his own sin that he had. He paid the price for it. So in these cases and many other cases, suffering is not always good. Okay, so cannot say that we look for suffering because we want to be in the way purified or better Christian. I think that's important for us even to recognize. On the other hand, you say all suffering is bad is also not right. Okay, suffering has its place in God's plan. That even in suffering, good can come out of it. And again, the classical case of Job, okay, he was much better person, although he never knew the reason for his suffering. But God, in a way, blessed him twice over. Okay, that's important. I think Joseph suffered, sold by the brother into slavery, became a slave, and had to thrown into prison for doing what is right. But at the end of it, God has his plan for Joseph to make him the prime minister of Egypt and be able to not only help the Egyptians, but even help God's chosen people, the Jews. I think that's important. Okay? So we cannot say all suffering is always good or all suffering is always bad. Okay, those are very extreme cases. Okay, so suffering can be for good. Suffering for our own sin also is bad. Okay, so I think that's important for us to keep that in mind. Number 6, all suffering is God's fault. Okay, and some people blame God. You make this world so bad, that's why we're all suffering. Okay, so we have read in the Bible, James chapter 1, okay, that God does not tempt anyone. God cannot tempt. Okay, God can test you to make you better, but God don't tempt you to make you fall. Okay, so God don't just make people suffer for the fun of it. I think in Job's case, he had a reason because he knew what Job was, and Job became better at the end of it, although it was a terrible suffering. So it is important to not blame all suffering on God. Sometimes our own sin causes us to suffer as we have sinned. Okay, sometimes the sin of others, parents or children, causes us to suffer. Sometimes just natural disaster. We live in a fallen world. Earthquake, typhoon, hurricane. Okay, all those is part of living in the fallen world. All this will be removed when we go to the new heaven and the new earth. I think that's important for us to remember. So suffering is not forever. Number 7, some people blame all suffering is due to the evil one, Satan's fault. Yes and no. Okay, a lot of times our own sin contributes to our suffering. Okay, for the classic example, we are talking about Adam and Eve. Yes, Satan tempted them, but they did not give in to the temptation. They could have said no. The case of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5, they tried to make people think that they are better than they actually are, and God judged them. So it is important to us That is, we don't blame Satan for everything. Don't give too much credit. Yes, Satan can help to tempt us, but it's up to us whether we want to give in to temptation or not. I think that's important. So not all suffering is God's fault, and not all suffering is Satan's fault. I think that's important for you and I to remember. Number 8, good Christians are exempt from suffering. Just because you are a good Christian doesn't mean in the way you will suffer. I think not exactly true, okay? There's a lot of good Christians undergoing suffering, the persecuted church. This month is the whole area of the persecuted church. And read all the verses there. We talk about whole area of suffering. If you want to follow Jesus, you will suffer. We want to know the power of resurrection, but also join him in his suffering. All those are verses in God's word. If anything, Jesus in his earthly ministry promised us that we will suffer for our faith. There is a price to pay for our faith. So I think that's important for us to remember. Okay? Number 9, suffering means that I'm a good Christian. Okay? That is also not right. Okay? We should not make a virtue of wanting to suffer for the sake of suffering. Okay? Yes, Job was a good Christian. Okay, and he suffered. But I think his case is exceptional rather than a rule. Okay? Daniel was a good Christian, and he suffered, but because he stood firm in the Lord. I think that's important for us to know. Okay? So you don't have to suffer just to prove your faith. But if suffering comes along, it's something that we take in our stride to know that God will help us through. God is with us, and God will continue to sustain us even as we go through the test of suffering. Suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance will help us to be a better Christian, better follower of Jesus. So in very simple form, in just starting for this week, whole area of sickness, pain, and suffering, I just share these 9 myths that sometimes Christians go around believing, but this whole area of sickness, pain, and suffering, whole area of evil in the world. So it's important for us as we start this whole topic for this week. It's part of our Christian life, a normal Christian life. And we should not always keep on pointing fingers if there's suffering, that we judge people, judge ourselves, or attribute to wrong reason. I think there's the whole area that we need to think through and wait upon God. And for some reasons, sometimes we know. Remember a great apostle like Paul, who had a thorn in the flesh. We don't know what a thorn in the flesh is. But being an apostle, he asked God to remove the thorn in the flesh, but God never did. Now God just says in 2 Corinthians 12, my grace is sufficient for you. I think sometimes as we go through it, we may not get a reply, or God will just give us the strength to persevere through in and through suffering. I think that's important. Okay? So just to remind us that as we talk about this whole area of sickness, pain, and suffering, that yes, there are some things attributed to sin because we live in a fallen world. Yes, sometimes we are responsible for our own suffering. Yes, sometimes others are responsible for our own suffering. God allows it for its reason. Satan can use it to try to make us fall. So I think all these are possibilities that we need to think through. And not one of these answers all the reasons why we suffer. So I just leave these thoughts with you even for today, for this short devotion, that truly God will help us and guide us, that as we go through sickness, go through pain and suffering, yes, we must come before God and ask Him. And there's nothing to say that you cannot pray for healing and for restoration. I think that's important, okay? But to find the actual reason why, and to say everybody else suffering is due to this reason, that is wrong. So I think that's important for us to keep that in mind.